A fifth innovation was public expenditure tracking surveys. Many countries simply do not know where public money goes. And one of the things that many development finance institutions like the World Bank or the Department for International Development in Britain sought to do was to create an audit trail by which citizens could watch money as it left the Treasury, went into the spending ministries, went down through the different levels of the spending ministry, and then out to frontline agencies. And what they discovered was, in many cases, that money actually disappeared between the time it was dispersed at the center and when it was supposed to arrive at the frontline service provider. And why did it disappear? It disappeared largely because of corruption. And therefore, if you could follow the trail of the money, the idea was that citizens would demand reform and would demand that their government be accountable for that tax money that it had been spending. Final innovation was to shorten the route of accountability. This is language used by the World Bank. So if you think about a democratic political system, there's political accountability through elections. But that formal political system creates a very long route of accountability. Let's say that you're a parent in that school, you don't like the performance of your local public school, you want to change the principal, or you want to change the curriculum, or you want to make sure that the teachers are showing up for work. In a democratic political system, sometimes they are very centralized, so you actually don't vote for a local representative, you vote for a party list in a national election. How does your unhappiness about your local school get up through the hierarchy as you cast your vote, and then filter its way down through that hierarchy so that it'll actually lead to better performance in your local school? Shortening the route of accountability meant creating a much more direct mechanism between the citizen and the government service provider that was actually responsible for that school. One way of doing that is through decentralization or some form of federalism, where powers are delegated away from the center, from the national government, to state, local, municipal, and even neighborhood levels of government. Another mechanism was to actually create direct means by which citizens could participate. Participatory budgeting that began in the city of Porto Alegre, Brazil, was an example of this, by which the government, the municipality, put up its budgets in a public forum, and there was a discussion among citizens, among civil society groups, as to the spending priorities for the municipality. So there have been a lot of efforts to reform the public sector. What all of the approaches in the previous slide have in common is the fact that they can all be subsumed under the economic principal-agent framework. They all use a monitoring and accountability framework. That is to say, they monitor agent behavior to see whether it corresponds with the wishes of the principal. If it does, the agent is rewarded, and if it does not, the agent is punished. All of them try to operate through incentives, primarily monetary incentives, sometimes through punishments, and they all try to mimic market mechanisms. For example, the introduction of competition into the provision of schooling. The question is, however, whether these approaches work. So there are a number of limitations to the principal-agent framework. To begin with, if you cannot measure the agent's behavior, you obviously cannot hold the agent accountable. We will get back to the question of what is measurable shortly. Secondly, in the public sector, there are quite frequently multiple principals. That is to say, in a private organization, there's one principal. It's the family owner of the business, or it's the shareholders, and they have a pretty simple mandate. They want to maximize profits. On the other hand, in the public sector, you can have multiple principals. You can have individual legislators. The president can have a different set of preferences from members of Congress. You have different interest groups, and oftentimes those principals are instructing the agent to do different things, sometimes downright contradictory things. And that's the third item on this list, that sometimes principals actually don't know what they want, or they want things that simply cannot be done simultaneously. Furthermore, principal-agent theory does not tell you something about a very critical aspect of delegation, which is how much autonomy to delegate to the agent. That is to say, how much independent judgment do you want the agent to use, as opposed to instructions, sometimes detailed instructions, coming from the principal. Let's begin with the first of the potential limitations to principal-agent, the question of whether you can monitor and accurately measure agent behavior. The chart you see in front of you is a way of trying to understand what's measurable. This time on the x-axis we have transaction volume, meaning how many decisions or actions is the agent, the government bureaucrat, let's say, expected to take in the course of a year, let's say, and it can range from low to high. A central bank, for example, takes relatively few decisions and therefore has a very low transaction volume. It raises interest rates, let's say, every 6 weeks or so. Obviously, they do more things than that, but compared to, let's say, a court system or a police force, which is in contact with a country over an extensive, over the entire area of the country, with many thousands of people involved, the transaction volume for the central bank is obviously much smaller. On the y-axis, we have specificity, meaning how easy is it to actually measure the behavior of the agent. And again, we've got 4 quadrants. And it's clear that if you stick some real-world government activities into this matrix, they end up in different places. So for example, as we said, central banking has got pretty high specificity because you can tell whether the bank is doing its job simply by observing inflation. On the other hand, something like guidance counseling is almost impossible to measure. You can give somebody really good advice when they're in high school, and the effect of that advice won't show up, for maybe 10, 20 years after the advice is given. And so forth. There are many things that are less measurable than others, and there are many things that have high transaction volume. And if you think about what's the hardest part of the public sector to actually monitor accurately, it has to do with those that have high transaction volume and low specificity. And so, a typical example is something like elementary school teaching, where it's hard to measure the quality of teaching, and there's many teachers spread across the whole country. More technical types of activities like central banking, let's say aircraft maintenance, if you're running a state-owned airline, telecoms, running a state railroad, are easier. They're technical, therefore you can measure the performance of the people running the organization much more easily, and they've got relatively low transaction volume. And indeed, many of the efforts that have been made in improving government performance have been to try to measure the impact of some of these hard-to-measure areas. So let's take something like elementary school teaching. In the 2000s, in the early 2000s, under George W. Bush, Congress passed a law called No Child Left Behind, which set up federally mandated national tests to measure teacher. Well, it was ostensibly trying to measure teacher and school performance. This law was repealed after about a decade because many teachers felt that it actually wasn't measuring the right things, that teachers were teaching to the test, and that in any event, the score that a student got on a standardized exam bore a very complex and indirect relationship to the teacher's performance in the classroom. And so that remains an area, although standardized testing is used very commonly in education reform, it is an area that is still fraught with considerable difficulties. The next slide simply shows the problem of multiple principles. So this is a diagram of the United States, in which you've got not just a president and Congress that are each composed of multiple units, and so the executive branch, ostensibly led by the president, has got multiple agencies that can be at loggerheads. So, for example, the State Department and the Pentagon may want completely different things when they're operating abroad in a foreign country. Congress obviously has different committees, different leaders, and can give very contradictory instructions to a bureaucracy. And then you have the states, which operate as an independent source of authority, and courts, which can operate completely independently of legislative branches on any of those levels. And all of those act as legitimate principles giving instruction to the agents, and for that reason, it's no surprise that the agents sometimes don't know what to do. In fact, the political scientist James Q. Wilson argues that in the United States, given this problem of multiple principles, oftentimes bureaucrats try to hide behind detailed rules, legalistic detailed rules, because they don't want to be blamed by warring principles that don't agree with each other. That is to say, the president on the one hand, members of Congress on the other, that they're not doing their job properly. Now, beyond the principal-agent framework, the Homo economicus economist approach to thinking about behavior in organizations, we also have what has been called, or could be called, the social capital approach. That is to say, human beings are indeed selfish individuals, but that's not all they are. They're motivated by things other than that. They are social animals, meaning that they are motivated by what I would say are biologically grounded emotions like pride, self-respect, group solidarity, and norm-following behavior. And in fact, in a group setting, in an organizational setting, people are intensely social. They're always looking around them to see how other people are behaving. And something that has been called social capital, that is to say, informal norms that promote reciprocity, truth-telling, reliable behavior, has often been described as a source of strength. It's a source of capital, just as financial capital or physical capital or human capital. So this diagram shows that there's things like factories, machines, physical capital that produce goods. There's human capital, the knowledge and skills that we carry around with us in our heads, but there's also a third type of capital which really has to do with our spontaneous ability to cooperate with one another, and that can be a source of economic wealth as well. If you think about what a society is, a human society, it actually is constituted by networks of trust. That is to say, the society as a whole has certain norms that all members, or virtually all of the members, share with one another, that allows them to live peacefully in that society together. Then within the society, there are other smaller networks of trust. Some of them overlap, some of them compete with each other. But a society is really composed of these different layers of circles, and a single individual can belong to multiple different layers and networks of trust. If you think about what an organizational or a corporate culture is, organizations have formal lines of authority. That's the pyramidal graph showing the hierarchical structure with the CEO at the top. But in addition to that, there's a network of trust, and in an organization that has a strong organizational culture, in addition to the formal lines of authority, there will be informal norms that support the cooperative behavior within the organization. If you flatten the managerial hierarchy, that is to say, take out layers of middle managers, trust networks are really critical for that to work, because all of a sudden you need to cooperate on a peer-to-peer level. You need to be able to work with workers, fellow workers, because you're no longer getting instructions from the big boss at the top. And conversely, there has to be a fair amount of cooperation between managers and workers, because a lot is being delegated. Much more is being delegated in a flat organization than in a very rigid hierarchical one. Finally, if you outsource to a service provider or to an implementing organization or to a contractor of some sort, there has to be a trust relationship there as well. Because a lot of times organizations will put their, in effect, future existence in the hands of somebody outside the organization, and if that organization does not deliver, then there will be